Hey, welcome to my AP US Notes video, Chapter 8, A New Republic and the Rise of Political Parties, by me, Kellen Mark. So, the chapter begins by discussing the demographics of the states in New England, the Mid-Atlantic, the South, and the West. So, the New England states were generally homogeneous in ethnicity. They were 82% English, and true to their history, they were extremely religious. Excuse me. The Mid-Atlantic region was very diverse, with English, Scotch, Irish, sort of Europeans, and African slaves and missionaries from Europe. Now, areas of the South were predominantly African American slaves and freedmen and poor white farmers that were ruled by a white oligarchy. And the West, like the newly formed states of Tennessee and Kentucky, were populated mostly by Scotch-Irish farmers and the sons of southern plantation owners trying to expand slavery. Now, after the Revolution and the subsequent Articles of Confederation and the ratification of the Constitution, the United States was still in a massive war debt to Britain, and had no national currency. Now, Alexander Hamilton, this guy, tried to change all that with his 5-point economic plan, which, in summary, was to establish a national bank of the United States, have the federal government pay all state war debts, use said Bank of the United States to establish a currency, produce protective tariffs on imported goods, and to reduce American dependence on British imports. Now, Hamilton wasn't the most popular politician, and before things could go into full effect, in the year 1804, he died after being shot in a duel by then Vice President Aaron Burr. Now, it goes on to discuss the elections of 1800, which, as many of you know, and we discussed in class, was the dirtiest election in American history. It was full of political mudslinging, personal and political attacks. Many of them were completely unfounded, and it was a race between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. It was also a race between the Republicans and the Federalists, who, as you can see, had many, many differences. Basically, if you take one stance on a political event or document, the Republicans and the Federalists had completely different views. The Republicans supported the French Revolution, if you can see that, and they backed Thomas Jefferson, who, of course, supported the French Revolution. The Federalists, on the other hand, were highly against the French Revolution, which they saw as basic anarchy. So, John Adams was against the French Revolution. And this pattern continues on with American stance with Britain, which the Republicans were highly against, but the Federalists, especially John Adams, were very pro establishing closer ties with the former mother country. The main difference between the Republicans and the Federalists were their stances on government. The Republicans wanted less centralization and more states' rights, and wanted a privatized economy, while the Federalists wanted a centralized government and a nationally controlled economy and currency. which plays right into the hands of Alexander Hamilton's economic plan. Now, the election of 1800 was won by Thomas Jefferson when he beat John Adams by one state, by the electoral votes of one state. Now, the main reasons why Adams lost were because he was unpopular with both Republicans and Federalists, mostly because of his unpopular policies with the French and his support of the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were basically acts that are reminiscent of the Arizona law nowadays, which victimized immigrants and extended the period of time someone has to live in the United States in order to be considered a citizen. Now, before this was going on, two notable rebellions occurred in the United States, both in Pennsylvania. First, the Whiskey Rebellion in 1791 was in western Pennsylvania because they were protesting the new federal taxes on grain, which they usually distilled into whiskey. There were some short skirmishes, between the rebels and federal troops, but by the time the main army led by former presidents and hero George Washington got to Pennsylvania, the movement was largely dissolved. And the second one, Fry's Rebellion in 1799, was in eastern Pennsylvania, and they were protesting federal taxes that were, in essence, supposed to raise money for a war with France, which I'll discuss later. But by the time the federal army got there, the most resistance they came across was from German farm wives pouring hot water on the soldiers. Now, this time was rife with political foreign policy issues for the up-and-coming United States. First off, they had issues with Spain on the border between Florida and Alabama and Georgia. Spain had complete claim over Florida, and in order to stop American expansion into the south, further south, they were using alliances with Native Americans, most notably the Creek, to try to halt the American advance. And then comes the French, who were right in the middle of their own famous revolution, complete with guillotines and beheadings. As I said before, Republicans and Federalists were split on support of the French Revolution. The Republicans were heavily supportive of it because it reminded them of the American Revolution, of the American peoples trying to overthrow tyranny, while the Federalists were against it because they saw it as excessively radical and violent and victimizing innocent civilians. This led to the XYZ. Some of this led to the XYZ affair, which was basically the culmination of failed diplomatic ties between French and the United States. And the XYZ affair was basically an American attempt to reestablish close ties with the French that they previously enjoyed, especially right after the Revolution. But three French agents, known at the time only as X, Y, and Z, refused to allow the American delegation to meet with the French Foreign Minister Talleyrand, unless Talleyrand and the three agents were paid massive bribes, and the Americans agreed to make massive concessions to the French government in terms of trading and impressment of sailors, which was also a major issue. Now, as I said before, a major part of the Adams administration was their stance on the French, which was they disliked the French Revolution. Remember the Federalists, and because of the general animosity between the French and the Americans, especially after the XYZ affair, an event called the Quasi-War occurred. It was fought mostly in the waters of the Caribbean by American privateers against French naval and merchant ships. It was an undeclared war that basically had its beginnings in bad economics and diplomacy. And the Adams administration was one of its main goals was to end the Quasi-War, which it did, but it also made major concessions to the French, like cutting off the 1778 economic agreement made by the two countries. And finally, the relationship between America and its old mother country came into play. So, the main issue that the Americans had with the British were that the British were still occupying old forts in the Ohio River Valley and were using Native American allies to try to stifle American expansion westward. Excuse me. This ended with the signing of Jay's Treaty, which was signed by the American Supreme Court Justice John Jay with a British delegation. It made major concessions to Great Britain, but it was very unpopular with Americans because it had so little to offer for the Americans. Alright, so in conclusion, especially with foreign policy,